Today's passage is from Judges chapter 7, verses 1 through 8. Today's passage is from Judges chapter 7, verses 1 through 8. The passage I'm going to read from is New International Version, NIV. If you have different version in hand, you can also read in your version. Early in the morning, Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, and all his men camped at the spring of Harod. The camp of Midian was north of them in the valley near the hill of Moreh. The Lord said to Gideon, "You have too many men. I cannot deliver Midian into their hands, or Israel would boast against me. My own strength has saved me. Now announce to the army, anyone who trembles with fear may turn back and leave Mount Gilead." So 22,000 men left, while 10,000 remained. But the Lord said to Gideon, "There are still too many men. Take them down to the water, and I will thin them out for you there. If I say this one shall go with you, he shall go. But if I say this one shall not go with you, he shall not go." So Gideon took the men down to the water. There the Lord told him, "Separate those who lap the water with their tongues, as a dog laps from those who kneel down to drink." 300 of them drank from cupped hands, lapping like dogs. All the rest got down on their knees to drink. The Lord said to Gideon, "With the 300 men that lapped, I will save you and give the Midianites into your hands. Let all the others go home." So Gideon sent the rest of the Israelites home, but kept the 300 who took over the provisions and trumpets of the others. Now the camp of Midian lay below him in the valley. Amen. Today is the second week that I want us to think about God's calling. January 9th, 2007. Do you know what this date is? January 9th, 2007. If you cannot recall, I'll tell you one of the most favorite quote from the day. An iPod, a phone, an internet communicator. An iPod, a phone, an internet communicator. An iPod, a phone, an internet communicator. An iPod, a phone. Are you getting it? This is the day when iPhone 3, the first smartphone that Apple has ever released to the world, was released. Believe it or not, January 9th, 2007 is another big date in human history. Because I'm not saying this because I'm an Apple fan. I'm saying this because it also had a really major impact in human history. Until then, if you want to listen to music, you had to purchase a separate device. If you remember this, you had a Walkman from Sony for radio. You had CD players. Some of you had, my generation was more like MP3 players. And also, if you wanted to use the internet, you needed a computer. I remember they invented a really small computer which didn't really work, which was a portable laptop. But if you needed the internet, you needed to have a computer to have access to the internet. However, as the iPhone was released in the world, the smartphones now let you listen to music. You can search, you can edit your documents, you can even create slideshows, you can edit videos, and you can do anything with smartphones nowadays. The development of smartphones have changed human life a lot, and they have a lot of great pure functions. However, on the other side, there were some things that also have impact in human life, and I want to call it out today. It's social media. Remember, if I told this to our youth kids on Friday, when I was a teenager, it was not really able to talk to friends without calling them landline. I remember I calling them Then say, if their mom answers, I say, hey, my name is blah, blah, blah. I want to speak to blah, blah, blah. And they answer the phone. And if I was staying on the phone too long, my parents say, you have to hang on. You are staying there too long. And then if you wanted to use the internet, your landline was not working. But now, so when I don't really need to worry about what my friends are going to talk about if my friends are not physically together. However, as social media is everywhere now, and as Kakao Talk, Discord, or WhatsApp, or some other texting maps have been developed, now kids, ourselves need to worry about what other people are going to talk about us, even when they are not physically together. And this kind of has a lot of impacts in our basic desire. I think one common desire that every single human being is share is this. We all want to be accepted. We all want to be recognized, and we also want to feel that we are involved in this group that we are a part of. And then sometimes we are kind of forced to do something. We are kind of sometimes feel not necessarily forced, for encouraged by our peers or other groups of people to live certain ways in our lives. And there are a lot of conditions that we have to match in order to be accepted, or in order for us to be feeling a part of in the group that we are. But now we know, if you open up the Instagram, there are a lot of people living dream lives as influencers. And then our kids are looking into, they almost live in the TikTok or Instagram nowadays, if you see them. And that's what they see, that's what they hear, and that's what they watch. And then we often try to define ourselves, and we often try to see and tell if we are doing a good life or bad life, sometimes based on what other people are commenting about us. And then those comments are easily made on social media as well. Each group has different requirements and conditions for us to be called a good person or a good member. However, now we know, as we try to fit ourselves in those different conditions and requirements, we are going to feel more vacant and empty in our lives. Because it is like we are giving the scoreboard of our life to someone else who does not really invest anything in our lives. And that is the struggle that every generation nowadays, maybe most generations nowadays, are dealing with. Since last week, we've been talking about the story of Gideon. Last week we talked about how God called Gideon. And I said, God is calling us, and because God is calling us, He, first of all, visits in the midst of our life. If that is, you are going through some suffering, God has come to the center of your suffering and then call you from there. And then the second point I shared with you is that God is calling us. God is calling us, and then when God is calling us, God wants us to surrender all the greeds and then ambitions or kinds of the ways of working that we try to do to Him, so that He can work through us. And then today is a next chapter of the story we talked about last week. After God called Gideon, what happened was the Midianites, another tribe, invaded Israel again. So if you are not here, if you don't remember what happened last week, let me give you a brief summary about what happened in last passage. This is from Judges chapter 6, verses 1 to 6. The Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and for 7 years He gave them into the hands of the Midianites. So Israel people did not worship God. They turned away from God. Instead of worshiping God, they worshiped Baal and Asherah, the gods that the people from Canaan used to worship. And then so God decided to punish them by sending other tribes into the land of Israel. And this is what the other tribes did to them. Because the power of Midian was so oppressive, the Israelites prepared shelters for themselves in mountain clefts, caves, and strongholds. Whenever the Israelites planted their crops, the Midianites, Amalekites, and other eastern peoples invaded the country. They camped on the land and ruined the crops all the way to Gaza. This Gaza is the same Gaza as we know now. And did not spare a living thing for Israel, neither sheep nor cattle nor donkeys. They came up with their livestock and their tents like swarms of locusts. It was impossible to count them or their camels. They invaded the land to ravage it. Midian was impoverished, so impoverished the Israelites that they cried out to the Lord for help. So what the people from Midian, the Midianites did, whenever Israel people tried to harvest the crops, then they invaded the land and then they took all the crops out. When they were about to kill the animals so that they could have some meat, Midianites invaded Israel and they took all the animals. So it was the Israel people who were working, and it was the Midianites who were taking all the profits or the fruits. Fruits is because they sinned against God. And then after this long period of suffering, God called Gideon to save them. And then today's passage is talking about what Gideon did after he was called by God. But from this, I want us to think about, I want to tweak the passage a little bit, and I want to think about what God's calling is about and what God's calling is demanding us to do through this story. So the first thing is this. When you live according to God's calling, God is calling other people around you through you. So if you obey God's calling and if you live as God has been calling you to do or calling you to be, God is not calling only you, but God is also calling other people around you to complete God's work. If you read Judges chapter 7, 1-3 one more time, early in the morning, Jerubbaal, Gideon, and all his people, men, camped at the spring of Harod. The camp of Midian was north of them in the valley near the hill of Moreh. For 7 years, Israel people have been feeling miserable because every time Midianites were invading their territory, they did not even have power, they did not even have ability to fight for themselves. And all of a sudden, when God called Israel people, let me continue to read, they gathered, and this is how many people they gathered. The Lord said to Gideon, you have too many men. I cannot deliver Midian in their hands, or Israel would boast against me. My own strength has saved me. Now announce to the army, anyone who trembles with fear may turn back and leave Mount Gilead, and 22,000 men left, and 10,000 remained. If you do a basic, simple calculation here, Israel people have been silent. They have been feeling powerless for 7 years. And all of a sudden, when God called Gideon, 32,000 men gathered to fight. 32,000 people gathered to fight. So when Gideon decided to obey God's will, people started seeing Gideon, and then they started seeing something different in him. And then that him decided to obey God, encouraged all the Israel people who were around him, and then 32,000 soldiers gathered to fight. Of course, God is sorting out some people until there are 300 people left. However, what I want us to focus on here is that while Israel people stayed silent and then they were not able to fight, there were 32,000 people gathered. Of course, 22,000 people did not want to fight, so they left. However, there were 10,000 people who were ready to fight, and then this change happened when Gideon has decided to obey God. So what I mean by God is calling other people through you when you obey God is this. If you read Ephesians chapter 1, verse 18, Paul writes, I pray that the eyes of your heart may be enlightened in order that you may know the hope to which he has called you, the riches of glorious inheritance in his holy people. So when God is calling you, God is giving you hope. And then as you live according to God's calling, and as you live holding on to this hope, other people who have been living without any hope start to see and receive this hope from God. And this hope is not about what you want. This hope is something from God, and then this hope is something God has planted in us, and then this hope is God is pouring to us when God created us. And this hope can be described, can be found in Ezekiel chapter 37. Ezekiel is the one who lived like 100 years after this happened. During the time of Ezekiel, he was a prophet. His people, Israel, was captured, destroyed by the Babylonian Empire completely. So they were captured to Babylonian, and they lived as refugees in Babylon. And then Ezekiel was crying, and then people who were left in the land of Israel were living a miserable life. And then in Ezekiel chapter 37, God shows a vision to Ezekiel, and the vision is this. When God took him to a valley, when Ezekiel was taken to the valley, all he saw was dry bones that did not have any sense of life, sign of life. They did not have any signs of water in. And when Ezekiel was brought in, God asked, do you think these dry bones can live? Ezekiel says, you only know. And God begins to bring hope to Ezekiel. And then God shows that when God breathed in his breath to these dry bones stand up, and they came back to life, and they became God's great army. That is what God's calling is enabling us to do. When we decide to live and following God's calling, the people around you who have been living their life as dry bones will come alive, because God is going to pour in God's hope to them through you. And then they will all stand as the army of God. What I mean by this is this. If you decide to live by your calling, broken families around you will be restored. Broken friendships will be restored. People who are thinking about suicide will stop and come back to life. Addictions will be stopped. And those who have lived without any hope will start having hope, because they are going to see something in you, and then those something will have positive influences on their lives. And in order for us to live like that, we have to remember God's calling is not about what or where, but it is about who. 32,000 people were strongly encouraged and felt ready to fight, and then even though 22,000 people have left. And you see the 10,000 Israel men who are ready to fight and go out fighting the battles for themselves and for God in front of you. But God did not lead them straight to the battlefield. Instead, God sourced them again, and this is how God sorted them. Verses 5 to 8. So Gideon took the men down to the water. There the Lord told him, separate those who lap the water with their tongues as a dog laps from those who kneel down to drink. 300 of them drank from cupped hands, lapping like dogs. All the rest got down on their knees to drink. The Lord said to Gideon, with the 300 men that lapped, I will save you and give the Midianites into your hands. Let all the others go home. So Gideon sent the rest of the Israelites home, but kept the 300 who took over the provisions and trumpets of the others. Now the camp of Midian lay below him in the valley. So here we only talk about we only ask about why did God choose 300 people? And then how did God choose 300 people? Yes, God chose 300 people as what the verse 6 says, but my question is, why did God need to choose only 300 people out of 10,000 people who were ready to fight? During this time, Midianites were the warriors. They were good at battles. They were good at invading other nations and take what they had. And Israel was not trained. Would it be better to have more people? And as we have read in verse 2, God did that because so that Israel people cannot boast. This is the story we know. But I want us to think about the other side, other aspect of this story. God only called 300 people to fight for this battle. Then what about the other people? 9,700 people. What about them? They were not called by God. God did not want to call them. Here we have to learn something, because God did not discard them. God has called these all 10,000 people. No, actually, God has called all the 32,000 people who were present to fight this battle. But they only had different types of callings from God. In order for you to battle, some are called to build the weapons. They do not need to be soldiers. For you to go to fight the battles, some people must be called to farm so that they can provide the foods. Some are called to cook. Some are called to care for and educate the children, because even during the battle, we have to raise the kids. Those who went home without going to the battlefield, they were also called to do something, as these 300 people were called to go to the battlefields. So what we can learn from this is this. We only focus on these soldiers who were ready to fight, who were called to fight. But their calling was different. That means God is calling all of you, but God is not really calling us. And then God's calling may be different in the specific time and specific occasion. You may be called to do something on this point, but you may be called to do something else like 10 years later. What God cares most from us is not about what we are doing. It's more about who you are and who you want to be before the Lord. This is why we need to focus on more about who we are than what we do before the Lord. The way we define who we are is adding layers to ourselves. If you are asked, who are you? Then we start with what our name is, what we do, what we like. Those are the factors that we use to define who we are. One thing I've been learning as I live in this world is that as I'm getting more experiences, as I'm getting more 1 year older and older and older, I'm getting more layers upon me that the world is providing. I'm a pastor, and then as being a pastor, there are some expectations I have to meet. And as a pastor, there are some ways of words that I need to use. I'm a pastor, therefore you have to behave in this way. If I live my life trapped in this image, I will never be able to follow God's calling, because what I'm focusing on is what other people say than what God is asking me to do and who God is wanting me to do. For this reason, knowing yourself is a very step for you, for me, and for everyone else as we discern what God's calling for us is. You know, every time, every day, the world and the people around us demand some layers. They demand expectations. They have the expectations from us. Then we are oftentimes encouraged to meet those expectations. Therefore, if we do not know the default setting of who we are, we will not be able to stand strong, because those layers are heavy upon us. What I mean by is this. If you are not ready to fight, you don't need to force yourself to go to battles because all other people were saying. 22,000 people here were brave enough to go back home. Remember, God's calling is not about what you do. We often think God's will and plan as like something hidden, right? So we often think if we start praying, God is going to come to us and say, you need to pray harder to find my will. Go and seek my will until you find. But you know, for us to understanding what God's will is actually coming from knowing God. And for us to know God, we have to trust God. And for us to trust God, we have to have experience of obeying God. And when we obey God, even though we feel like we are obeying God's calling, sometimes we need to end up being and stuck in a disappointment, because maybe that's the destiny that God wants us to be. And then as we go through that time, we can trust God more. of 10,000 gathered soldiers to fight for God's people, 9,700 people had to go home. But they were not discouraged. Because for us, it's not about what we do. It's about who we are. I shared this quote with our youth group last Friday. God maybe does not really care what college you go to. Maybe God does not really care what job you have. But don't hear me wrong. What college you go to is not nearly as important as who you are going to be when you get there. If we only focus on what, we often lose who we are. Because in most times, God is not calling you to be a specific person, but God is more caring about who you are going to be, who you are surrounded with, and who you see God as. And the only way for you to see what God has next for you is to give yourself fully to what He's got you doing now. Sometimes God tells you to rest. Sometimes God tells you to go home. Sometimes God tells you to lay down and stop. Even though we were forced to stop by God, that does not mean we have failed. Because you know what? Because who you are never change in God. We often try to be these 300 people. But for these 300 people to shine, the other 22,000 people who decided to leave the place because they had some other stuff to do, and there were 9,700 people who decided to obey what Gideon said. We all need those people because all these people are called to be in a different place at that specific moment. So what we need to remember is this. God's works are done by people who follow their calling in their daily lives. It could be small things or big things. It could be important things or not important things in our eyes. However, when all these people gather, when this all obedience meet, and when all these small works and big gathers come together, they're actually singing one song. That is God. So I don't really know where you are in terms of your spiritual journey. But I pray that as we go out to the world, let's more focus on what is God calling us to be and which kind of person God is asking us to be other than what we are doing. Because as long as we know who we are, we can do what is right in God. And remembering this, I want us to think about this question. What do you do when your will and God's will are different? And the last question is this. How do you want to be remembered by your family, friends, co-workers, neighbors, and other church people? And by thinking about this, I want to encourage you to ask one more question. What is God calling you to be? And with what type of people is God asking you to be surrounded with? And who is God to you today, right now?